This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome to Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, session 47, not covering all of Ezra. I thought we might cover all of Ezra, but you know, with the book of Ezra, there was so much introductory work I wanted to do that I felt like I didn't want to shortcut the introductory work so I could do the whole section. And really, Ezra and Nehemiah are one book. So next session, we might wind up doing the second half of Ezra and Nehemiah, or I might break this into 3 sessions. I just have to see how it all shakes out when I decide. It really is one of the hardest things for me about this class is deciding what portions of the text not to cover. Because so much of it's good and important and meaty and good story. This is why I'm horrible at, I guess, at survey classes. I'm like, oh, but I've got to tell them this story. I can't skip that story. So, so we won't be covering all of Ezra tonight, but we will hopefully get ourselves through a chunk of the first portion of Ezra and Nehemiah. But let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we thank you for making us in your image to share in the ordering of your world. Receive the work of our hands in this place now to be set apart for your worship, the building up of the living and the remembrance of the dead, to the praise and glory of your name, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
This is the collect for the consecration of the church. I've used this collect before with you all, but very appropriate for someone like Ezra, who's all about the rebuilding of the temple. Thought it'd be a good opening prayer for us. So we're going to, I got to fix that slide right there. As we move into Ezra, 3 texts will be helpful. The first 2 are the ones that are very familiar to you at this point, but I decided to break from tradition and not use the interpretation series for my commentary. Instead, I'm going to use Davies' commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah in Berit Olam. Berit Olam is a wonderful commentary series that comes out of the Catholic Church. Really great scholarship. And what I really love about the approach of Davies and Berit Olam and his book on Ezra, Nehemiah, and Berit Olam is he takes a rhetorical critical approach. So really using the insights of rhetorical criticism to figure out, kind of suss out what's going on in the text. And so I thought that would be a good kind of a different approach to look at as we are engaging into these books. So that'll be our text. But let's do a little review first. You remember from 2 Chronicles. Where is Rehoboam when he is made king? And what does that suggest? Anyone remember from a couple weeks ago?
Is it a high place?
Very good. One of the high places. Where in the Holy Land do you think it might be located that might be problematic?
Was it Hebron? No.
Yeah. No, David was at Hebron. Rehoboam is at Shechem. This is an old northern high place about 40 miles north of Jerusalem. And the problem with this is that rather than the northern tribes coming down to him for his accession to the throne, he's going to them, which is already suggesting that the unity of the United Kingdom is starting to slip at this point, that the kingdoms are starting to divide. It's a sign of weakness to go to them. This is like, I don't even read these management textbooks that, if someone has a problem, they give these to you in seminary too back in the day. They don't as much anymore. If someone's got a problem, have them meet you at your office. Don't go to their home. Do it on your turf. And then when they get here, make them wait 5 minutes before they come in. Like all of this stuff that and I was like, I remember reading this as a pastor and being like, oh my, does this work? So he's missing all of the great management leadership textbooks. Don't go to them, make them come to you. Is Pharaoh Shishak or Shoshank, depending on how you read Egyptian, advances upon the southern kingdom. How does Rehoboam respond? Do you remember this? What Rehoboam, when Shishak is coming in, what Rehoboam does and how it relates to kind of the key theme of Chronicles? He repents, right? all of the southern people repent as called for in Solomon's prayer in First Chronicles 7, that when people pray to this place and repent, then God turn and forgive. So they recall the repentance called for by Solomon's prayer and the disaster is averted. Does that mean that Shishak returns home? Did the Egyptian threat evaporate on Rehoboam? Do you remember that?
He appointed someone.
Yeah, he maintained, no, the Lord permits Shishak to reestablish Egyptian hegemony in the region so that they can know what it means to serve another nation instead of God. It's a foreshadowing of the exile to come. So Shishak establishes some control in the region, and already the independence of the people began to slip. Skipping ahead to chapter 17, Jehoshaphat, which is, I think, great name. If I ever do have another child, I think I'll name him Jehoshaphat. Anyone have a remembrance of what is the most significant reform of Jehoshaphat? Instituted a campaign to educate the Judean people in the book of the law of the Lord, sending officers, Levites, and priests throughout the cities of Judah. He was a man of education and formation. So that was a really rather remarkable thing. And it actually reflects something specific about the post-exilic era, that growing importance of the Torah book, which becomes essential to the Israelite religion in the post-exilic era, and of the Levites as the authorized teachers of that Torah book. All right, we're doing great. Ken Workinger apparently fell asleep during the last class. He's missing all of these, but that's all right. Mary's judging.
I don't think I was here.
What are the sins of Zedekiah, the final king of Judah? Anyone remember that? Refuses to humble himself before Jeremiah.
Doesn't he like listen to the young kids?
What was that?
Doesn't he listen to the young guys instead of the old guys?
Oh, you're thinking back to Rehoboam. That was what Rehoboam did, but that's not far off. You're only off by like 400 years. So that was a good shot. But that was all. That was at the beginning of, and that was Second Chronicles, 1. So you're only off by 36 chapters. Zedekiah is the last of the kings of the divided kingdom. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and it's particularly bad because he'd sworn an oath of fealty to Nebuchadnezzar by Yahweh. So by breaking an oath sworn by Yahweh, he demonstrates a complete lack of faithfulness. And then the last one is he leads all the leading priests and people along this lack of faithfulness. So it's not just in First and Second Kings, so often it's the rulers or the elite that seem to have gone astray, while the people are kind of hapless and corrupted sheep without a shepherd sort of image. But in First and Second Chronicles, the whole people bear the burden for this sin. So they are also the ones. So they go right along with him. He leads everyone along with him in his apostasy. I don't remember what nation and leader defeats the Babylonian Empire to provoke hope of return. Handsome guy.
Persians.
The Mede Persians. Then you remember the name of the emperor?
Xerxes.
Cyrus.
Cyrus? He's not Xerxes. Oh.
We're gonna get Xerxes a little later. This is Cyrus the Great. The Persian Empire defeats Media, Lydia, Babylon becomes one of the ancient world's greatest empires, ruling territory from Greece in the east to India in the west. When I was working on this section, and I got to get a picture of Cyrus in here for the PowerPoint slide. Clearly the class would fall apart without that picture. And what I came across is a picture some Christian artists did of Cyrus set alongside a profile of Donald Trump, who apparently is seen as the modern Cyrus for the way he protected the nation of Israel during his time as presidency. And then I threw up a little in my mouth, and I decided I wasn't doing that anymore. The people are in exile for 70 years. Do you remember the symbolism of 70 years of exile? It connects to an important part of the Torah. What's 7 divided by 10?
7.
There you go. Is 7 an important number for the Hebrew people?
Yes.
Sabbath, right? This is a Sabbath of exile, a time for the land and the people to heal so that they can rebuild. And then apparently I did that slide twice because I'm that good at my job. All right, any questions on 2nd Chronicles before we move into Ezra and Nehemiah? Okay, like I said, I've got a good amount of introductory stuff to get through here to kind of help get you a sense of how Ezra and Nehemiah fits into the larger biblical canon and narrative. First off, Ezra and Nehemiah is one book. It's 2 books in our Christian Bible, but it was always written as one scroll. It wasn't divided into 2 until the medieval Christian Bibles. And then later, Judaism, they started following the Christian practice of dividing them, oddly enough. But Ezra and Nehemiah had always been seen consistently as a single narrative. First Esdras, which is Esdras is the Greek rendering of Ezra's name, in the Septuagint would have been the version most common in the early church. It's very similar to our version of Ezra and Nehemiah, though it removes some of the parts of the career of Nehemiah, instead ascribing them to the work of Ezra instead. Much of this confusion of what actually is Ezra and Nehemiah is very similar to what we talked about earlier when it comes to differences in Jeremiah, differences in Daniel. All of these works that were really drawn together in the post-exilic time. Remember, you've got 3 communities in the exilic and post-exilic world. You've got the Babylonian exiles off in Babylon, probably holding on to Hebrew. You've got the people who remain in the land, and then you've got Israelite exiles in Alexandria in Egypt, which is a part of the Greco-Roman Empire at this point, the Greco Empire at this point. And so you're getting different forms of these books put together. And there's a lot of, and in fact, I mean, depending on what, even Orthodoxy, Roman Catholic, they all kind of hold these books a little differently, what they would consider to be the authorized, the actual text. Our Ezra and Nehemiah in our Bible is based upon the Masoretic text, the Hebrew version, not upon the Septuagint that would have been familiar in the early church, that they would have been using that point was called First Esdras. And then there were 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Esdras, and I'm not even going to bother trying to explain all those because it just gets even more confusing and even more dull. Other points of context, the books themselves of Ezra and Nehemiah describe the rebuilding and the reform in post-exilic Judah through the latter half of the 5th century. So it's all about what happens after the exile, what that rebuilding looks like, what that reform of the language looks like. And so these texts span the first return of the exiles, which happened in 439 or 438 BC, all the way to the end of the 5th century, focused especially on the reign of Artaxerxes of Persia, 458 to 430 BC. So as you can see, that's a significant period of time that they wind up covering. The author himself, or the author compiler, we think maybe have been Nehemiah, who used the memoirs or the journals perhaps of Ezra, or maybe it was someone else who used the journals or memoirs of Ezra and Nehemiah. You can notice every now and then in the text it uses the I pronoun as opposed to just talking in the 3rd person. It switches to 1st person, so that's why we think they're probably some use of journals. It also seems to be using archival letters and lists, all of this to record the history of the Jewish return. I have no idea what it says the Jewish form. Clearly, my hand stopped working when I was typing this slide. We're going to skip past the slide real quick before I'm more embarrassed. This period witnesses what would really be known as the emergence of Judaism proper, as distinct in certain and important ways from pre-exilic Israelite religion. And this is something I really want to emphasize because we tend to conflate Judaism or Israelite religion as being one thing throughout history. But if you think of Christianity over the course of several hundred years, what we do at church on Sunday compared to what Christians did at church even 200 years ago is pretty different. So Judaism, as we understand it more today, more in the context of the 1st century, really emerged during this post-exilic time. Anything you do to try to understand the Israelite religion from before the exile is an act of historical reconstruction based upon the text given us, but we don't know for sure what it actually did look like. So what we're seeing here is Judaism, as we now know it, beginning to truly take the shape that it winds up taking. There's some historical difficulties as well in Ezra and Nehemiah. For example, there's this phrase, the people of the land. We don't know who the people of the land were exactly. Were they the Samaritans? Were they someone else? So who are the people of the land? How does that relate to the narrative Ezra and Nehemiah is trying to craft? Davies, the author of our Digging Deeper text, as I said, takes the approach of rhetorical criticism to Ezra and Nehemiah. So his attempt is to look at the strategies, situations, and effects in the relationship between the author and audience. So what is the rhetorical goal of Ezra and Nehemiah in relation to its audience? What are the strategies the compiler employs? How can that help us understand the text a little bit better? It's a rhetorical critical commentary. 3 key emphases you're going to find in Ezra and Nehemiah. Number 1, the successful completion of both the temple and the walls of Jerusalem despite opposition. And there's opposition to both, opposition to the rebuilding of the temple and opposition to the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. So that the rebuilding is successful, but there is opposition is the first key. Second, the crisis of intermarriage and national identity. So can indeed the Jewish people be married to people of other nations, other cultures, or not? That's a huge crisis in Ezra and Nehemiah that we didn't get to in the reading for this week, but we will get into the reading for the next session. A profound concern for the renewal of the covenant and the reform based on the law among the returning exiles in Jerusalem. This is what will save us. This is what will help us be God's people again. We must renew our covenant with God. We must reform ourselves according to the law of Moses. All of these things are central to the goals of Ezra and Nehemiah. What's essential to the author, particularly purity of faith in Yahweh, the God of Israel, that will only be found by keeping the law, keeping the Torah. So this is the goal, kind of the rhetorical strategy and aim of the author compiler of Ezra and Nehemiah. Questions before we dig a little deeper?
At what point is it that the Jewish people stop sacrificing? I thought it was right about here, but no, they're sacrificing like crazy.
Yeah, the end of the sacrifices takes place with the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD.
After Christ. Okay.
After the time of Christ. And actually, this is something that scholars use to date texts of the New Testament, because you can kind of tell when you're reading certain texts of the New Testament whether or not the temple has already been destroyed or if it's something that has not yet happened. And so if they want to date a text as early in the New Testament, generally one of the points of evidence is this text does not seem to have knowledge of the destruction of the temple, or vice versa. If there's clear evidence that this text knows the temple was destroyed, then it's most likely a later text after the destruction of the temple. And what that happens then is the kind of, so like I said, the return from exile is really the establishment of Judaism as we know it, beginning to be as we know it today. But the second key defining moment was that destruction of the temple in the 1st century, because that was the moment in which the 3 sects of Judaism, which were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Zealots. So the Zealots believed in reestablishing the nation by a violent rebellion against Rome. The Sadducees were the wealthy and aristocratic elite, particularly powerful in the temple, that thought, make peace with Rome, maintain our temple sacrifice, and we'll be okay. The Pharisees were the ones who said, focus on synagogue worship, focus on reading Torah, focus on ritual cleanliness and holiness and purity and all of that. After the destruction of the temple, the Zealots caused it because they rebelled. The temple's gone, so the Sadducees have lost their power. And so the Pharisees are the one who take power really in Judaism. In Rabbinic Judaism, which is what most of us know of as Judaism today, is really the descendant of the Pharisees. That became, because the Pharisees are hugely important in the Gospels, but they were not hugely important in the time of Jesus. The reason the Pharisees are so important and such an important conversation partner for Jesus in the Gospels reflects the late 1st century reality, where the early Christians were primarily engaging with Pharisees after the destruction of the temple, not anymore Sadducees or Zealots. And so there's a historical reality going on even in the recounting of the Gospels. Great question, Barbara. Anything else before we dive in? All right. Let's begin with Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, which, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, is really a repetition of the end of Second Chronicles. So Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdoms, and also in a written edict declared, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let all survivors in whatever place they reside be assisted by the people of their place with silver and with gold, with goods and with animals, besides free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem." So this is the great momentous decree of Cyrus. That's annoying. Apparently my bullets got out of order here. Sorry about that. The first 6 chapters of Ezra are a description of this first return, and it begins with this decree of the Jewish exiles, first under Zerubbabel, and then the rebuilding of the temple. They're constructed from a hybrid of imperial decrees, letters, inventory, censuses, and narratives. All of those are playing a role in this. King Cyrus, who we get here in verses 1 through 4, was the Persian king who reigned from 559 to 520 BC, and who conquered Babylon in 539 BC, thus founding the Persian Empire. When he conquers the Medes, it becomes known as the Mede-Persian Empire. Sometimes you hear it described that way. And as I said, these verses at the beginning of Ezra begin with the same text that ended Second Chronicles, the promise of return, and that Cyrus' action is based upon Yahweh's command. And this is fascinating in the text, because Cyrus is using the name of the Lord. He's saying Yahweh, the Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. So as Ezra tells the story, Cyrus sees himself as the instrument of Yahweh, the God of the Jewish people. Now that's probably not actually a very accurate description of Cyrus's decree. In fact, a little discursus to do a little archaeological work here. There is something known as the Cyrus cylinder. This is a cylinder from the time of King Cyrus of Persia that we have actually still access to. It's an ancient clay cylinder. It's now broken into several pieces, on which is written a declaration in Akkadian cuneiform script in the name of Cyrus the Great. It sets out the genealogy of Cyrus. It extols Cyrus as the leader who repatriated the Babylonian exiles to their homeland, who restored their sanctuaries. What's fascinating about the Cyrus cylinder, it does not mention the Judean people, does not mention Yahweh. None of that is here. It does acknowledge that, Cyrus is so great. He sent all the Babylonian exiles back home. He helped them restore their sanctuaries, but the Judeans aren't mentioned by name. That said, the Cyrus cylinder does corroborate the kind of enlightened approach of Cyrus, who returned the Jews to their home. And what it indicates is the return of the Jewish people to their home was part of a larger system that Cyrus had. Before, the idea was in imperial ancient Near East, when you conquer a people, you need to decimate their view of their God. You need to take them out of their homeland, mix them around, have them enter marriage, get rid of their national identity, because all of that will be a threat to you as an empire. Cyrus's approach is massively different. He says, well, what do I care what nation they call themselves and what God they worship, so long as they pay their tribute? So Cyrus's approach was, no, send them all home. Let them rebuild their sanctuaries. A happy people are a tax-paying people. And that was his, and really, for all intents and purposes, it was a remarkably successful approach to imperial rule, but very, very cosmopolitan, very, very forward-thinking for his own time in the ancient Near East. So in the rebuilding, though, it's seen not only of the temple, but of the city of Jerusalem. And you see that in verses 1 through 4, which is the home of Yahweh. Both of those are essential to this beginning of the text. Thoughts, comments on that? Weren't any of you familiar with the Cyrus cylinder before? Am I just making this up? No, I could just make all of this stuff up. That's excellent to know. I'll have to keep that in mind as I continue to mess with you. Excellent. All right. Well, moving along in the text, beginning in verse 5. The heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred, got ready to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. All their neighbors aided them with silver vessels, with gold, with goods, with animals, and with valuable gifts, besides all that was freely offered. King Cyrus himself brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. King Cyrus of Persia had them released into the charge of Mithridates, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the inventory: gold basins, 30, silver basins, 1,000, knives, 29, gold bowls, knives, 29, gold bowls, 30, other silver bowls, 410, other vessels, 1,000. The total of the gold and the silver vessels was 5,400. All these Sheshbazzar brought up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. So remember, we've got three people mentioned here: Judah and Benjamin, which were the tribes that constituted the southern nation of Judah, and the Levites, who were the tribe of the religious leadership. So that's why those are the three that were mentioned, because remember, the other 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were lost during the Assyrian defeat of Israel. Bits and pieces of those northern 10 tribes still persist and remain, but for the most part, those 10 tribes are lost after the Assyrian defeat in the 8th century. The return of the sacred vessels, which is meticulously laid out here in very careful detail, symbolizes the continuity of the second temple with the destroyed Solomonic temple. It also kind of, in some ways, it kind of reminds you of the Egyptian Exodus, the people taking the spoils with them. If you remember that, when the people went, in Exodus left, they took the spoils of the Egyptians with them because of the 400 years of slavery as they went. So you get some kind of a sense to that this is in some ways a second Exodus going on among the people. Sheshbazzar was a Jewish leader of the early return. He was the first governor of the Persian province of Yehud, which is what this area becomes known under the Persian Empire. In this text, of course, he is called a prince. He may have been a descendant of David. It is absolutely pretty clear that Ezra wants you to see this as a descendant of David, that this is the possibility of the restoration of the Davidic monarchy. But don't follow Ezra's hopefulness too hard. This is just a governor of a Persian province. This is no prince, this is no royalty, at least not yet. Questions on that before we skip to chapter 3? So the first thing that's rebuilt is the altar in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. When the 7th month came and the Israelites were in the towns, the people gathered together in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, with his fellow priests, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, with his kin, set out to build the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it as prescribed in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the neighboring peoples. That in Hebrew, that's the people of the land. That phrase that we're going to see again. And they offered burnt offerings upon it to the Lord morning and evening. And they kept the festival of the booths as prescribed and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the ordinance as required by each day. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings of the new moon, and all the sacred festivals of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who made a freewill offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. So they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food and drink and oil to the Sidonians and the Tyrians, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa, according to the grant that they had from King Cyrus of Persia. So the rebuilding begins, and the first part of the rebuilding is the rebuilding of the altar, because the ability to resume sacrificial worship on Jerusalem is what's seen as most central to the recovery of a sense of national identity. This was the central means of religious expression in the ancient world, this idea of having a functioning sacrificial priesthood. So it makes sense that this is where they go to first. Jeshua and Zerubbabel as well. This is an example of a pattern you're going to see assumed throughout this book of dual leadership by a priest and a secular leader. There's almost always a priestly leader and a secular leader who operate hand in hand. Here it's Jeshua and Zerubbabel. The restoration of the altar follows the law of Moses, likely some form of the Pentateuch, making it clear that we're doing all of the rules that Moses had laid out for what this altar should look like. However, there begins to be seen here some form of tension with the local inhabitants, the neighboring people or the people of the land. This is a major theme of Ezra and Nehemiah. Some see in this tension that this is a tension between the returning exiles, returning Judeans, and those who remained in the land regarding who constitutes authentic Israel. But who the people of the land are, we're not quite sure, as I said. But there seems to be some real tension here about the return and about what the restoration of the altar might mean. So continuing in verse 8 with the founding of the second temple itself. So in the second year after their arrival to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel and Jeshua son of Jozadak made a beginning together with the rest of their people, the priests and the Levites, and all who come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to have oversight of the work on the house of the Lord. And Jeshua with his sons and his kin, and Kadmiel with his sons, Binnui, Hodaviah, along with the sons of Henadad, the Levites, their sons and their kids. Together they took charge of the workers in the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments were stationed to praise the Lord with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals according to the direction of King David of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, quote, for he is good and his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people responded with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of families, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, they wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many had shouted for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted so loudly that their sound was heard far away. So, of course, celebration at the founding of the temple, once again, a common ancient Near Eastern practice, something you would expect to happen at the rebuilding. Remember that in Chronicles, David's crowning achievement was the development of the liturgy. And that's why, once more, this is all according to the rules of David, how David told us this had to be done. In many ways, Ezra and Nehemiah is a continuation of that theme we had in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. At the same time, the weeping of older people resonates with post-exilic sources, which often contrast the splendor of Solomon's temple with the less glorious post-exilic second temple, where, you know, they look at the new temple, it's like, oh my gosh, this is not what this looked like so many years. I remember back in my day, oh, it was so much bigger, so much more beautiful. Now, it's hard to tell how much of this is nostalgia, how much of this is historical accuracy. Because remember, the size of the temple as it's described in 1st and 2nd Kings compared to the size of the temple as described in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, massive difference. 1st and 2nd Chronicles gives you the preacher count, much higher, much more enthusiastic about how big it actually was. And so it's not really clear, was the second temple, it was definitely kind of a sad little temple compared to the ancient Near East. But was Solomon's temple really the great majestic building that the people remember from 100 years ago? Or is this the story of their ancestors kind of embellished over the years of exile? It's not clear. But regardless, the text seems to believe, and the exiles seem to believe, that this is not nearly as beautiful as what the second temple, as Solomon's temple had been. Questions, thoughts?
It's interesting, Jared, it doesn't say any of that in the text, though, right? It just says that they wept.
Yeah, it just says that they wept because, well, When they saw the first foundations, the first house on its foundation, they wept with a loud voice when they saw the house built. Many sounded for joy. Yeah, it doesn't say in this text that it's because of how much smaller it was.
Yeah.
But in other post-exilic sources, we do see that said a little more explicitly. So that's where the inference, and that's why the people are crying, some of the older people.
Yeah, that struck us when we were reading it. It's like, well, why are they weeping?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah, it wouldn't make sense to you unless you kind of know the other sources that could, and really, I mean, and this was a big part why it was when King Herod, who is kind of this puppet king, when he wanted to establish, himself as the real king of Israel, this is why he spent all that money building Herod's temple, which is really the third temple. The Herodian temple was a beautiful, gigantic, huge source. It was because Herod was trying to bring back the glory of the Solomonic temple compared with the rather simple temple that the exiles had rebuilt.
Yeah, that drawing looks sort of mid-century modern. It reminds me of, I'm just old enough to remember the old post office in Grand Haven, as opposed to the hideous box post office we have now. I was looking at that drawing, it's like, yeah, that looks kind of mid-century modern. It's really
You're
good.
right, very simple, clean lines, nothing too terribly ornate. Don Draper actually did the advertising for this from Mad Men. Absolutely.
Clean, yeah, that's nice.
Everybody have a Coke. Well, and I think there's something, one second.
God bless you.
There's something about how tastes change though as well, which I think is a real thing, because I mean, there are people who, look at mid-century modern church buildings, kind of the architectural style common in mid-century Catholic and Anglican and Episcopal and Lutheran Christianity, and weep when they compare it to the beauty of the older Neo-Gothic styles. And I mean, there's something about, what seems beautiful and magnificent shifts, right, from generation to generation. And so, that maybe that's a part of that here, that the sensibilities of the people were to more of those clean lines, those simple but beautiful spaces that you often see in church buildings constructed in the mid-20th century, compared to the more ornate Neo-Gothic style like St. John's, which is an old Carpenter Gothic style building. I mean, that could be a part of it too, that maybe this is a shift in the sensibilities of the people. Everything old will be new again eventually. That is certainly the case. The sound of the rejoicing and weeping tied together, though, alerts the neighbors, which triggers opposition once more. And that's what we're going to hear about beginning in chapter 4. When the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and led the family and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we've been sacrificing to him ever since the days of King Esarhaddon of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the families in Israel said to them, "You shall have no part with us in building a house to God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus of Persia has commanded us." And the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah, made them afraid to build. They bribed officials to frustrate their plan. And throughout the reign of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of King Darius of Persia. So once more, it's unclear who the people of the land are. This could be that these are foreign intellectuals or bureaucrats brought into the northern kingdom by Assyria to administer the territory. So these are not actual descendants of ancient Israel. These are some Assyrian people brought in to kind of run the northern kingdom after the destruction. And so they adopt some of the northern Israel practices, but these aren't genetically, biologically, genealogically linked. That's a possibility. It could be that these are disenfranchised former landholders. So these are people that perhaps owned the land, and then the exiles come back. They're like, "Oh, this is my land now." That's a possibility. This could be the Samaritan upper class. So the people who remained in the land after the exile, who remarried, mixed with the peoples of the land, but who believed they maintained the authentic ancient worship of Israel. We don't know who they are. All we do know is that tension is here. And it's going to appear again in the second part of Ezra with this crisis of mixed marriages. And we'll see that in the next session. What's fascinating, though, is the repatriated Judeans insist that they are the sole legitimate remnant of Judah. They want to preserve their ethnic and religious boundaries, and so they don't allow anyone to assist, which has always seemed to me kind of sad. I mean, you're this refugee people, you returned home, you're trying to build the land, and people who certainly at least are presenting themselves as your ancestors, people who have been maintaining the worship of Yahweh ever since the Assyrian exile 200 years ago. They say, let us help you. Let us help you rebuild. And they say, no, this is our job. Cyrus gave it to us. You cannot help with any of it. So you can see that there's a deep tension here. And some of this tension, once more, is, kind of, scholars disagree whether or not the Samaritans of the first century are the same as the kind of left behind people of this time. But this is one of the reasons some scholars think it's likely. This explains why, the Good Samaritan is such a big deal. This explains why Jesus's praising of the Samaritans would have been so unsettling to the Jewish people in the first century, because they weren't even allowed to participate right here with the rebuilding of the temple. Ahasuerus, I should have continued that in verse 6. In the reign of Ahasuerus, in his accession, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. That's when the rebuilding starts. This is Xerxes the First that Barbara was mentioning. Ahasuerus is his name here. I'm pretty sure I spelled that right. Oh, great. This is an emperor, a Persian empire who winds up very prominent in the book of Esther. So stick that name in the back of your head. We're going to come back to that when we do the book of Esther. But he's showing up here as well. An exchange of documents in the rest of chapter 4 ends with the work of reconstruction halted by imperial order. Cyrus is no longer king. We've gone to a couple of different kings, and so it's like, nope, we're done. No more, stop the rebuilding. And it all kind of draws to a close. And then as we pick up in chapter 5, we'll see how it rebuilds. Now, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shittel, and Joshua, son of Jehozadak, set out to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and with them were the prophets of God helping them. At the same time, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-Bozani and their associates came to them and spoke to them thus: who gave you a decree to build this house and to finish this structure? They also asked them this: what are the names of the men who are building this building? But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until a report reached Darius, and an answer was returned by letter in reply to it. So the work ceases until finally the Haggai and Zechariah arrive on the land to inspire the people to continue the task of reconstruction. I want to acknowledge, because of course Haggai and Zechariah have their own books later. In Haggai and Zechariah, the failure, the stopping of the reconstruction is basically because the refugees got tired. They got worn out. They kind of lost energy for the work. And Haggai and Zechariah kind of re-inspire them. That's different than Ezra and Nehemiah, where the fault of the rebuilding ending, this wasn't the laziness of the exiles. No, these were the people of the land who sent letters to the emperor to issue a cease order, all of that. So the blame is being shifted very clearly in Ezra and Nehemiah from where that blame falls in Haggai and Zechariah. So I just want to draw that to your attention. You'll see that later on when we do Haggai and Zechariah. As I said in the books of each of these prophets, they exhort the leaders in the community to rebuild. Tattenai is a Persian official who's also mentioned in non-biblical sources. This is another correlation. We're going to start seeing increasingly now people and things mentioned in the Hebrew Bible that have correlating evidence that this is real, from extra biblical sources, and Tattenai is one of those. He is the governor of the province beyond the river, which is what they called this province of Persia, of which Yehud is a subunit of the province beyond the river. So this is a legit person. So the legitimacy of this work is questioned beginning in verse 6. The copy of the letter that Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-Bozani and his associates, the envoys who were in the province beyond the river, sent to King Darius. They sent him a report in which it was written as follows: to Darius the king, all peace. May it be known to the king that we went to the province of Judah, to the house of the great God. It is being rebuilt of hewn stone, and timber is laid in the walls, and the work is being done diligently and prosperous in their hands. Then we spoke to those elders and asked them, who gave you decree to build this house and to finish the structure? We also asked them their names for your information, so that we might write down the names of the men at their head. This was their reply to us. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the house that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and finished. But because our ancestors had angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried away the people to Babylonia. However, King Cyrus of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, made a decree that this house of God should be rebuilt. Moreover, the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem and had brought into the temple of Babylon, these King Cyrus took out of the temple in Babylon, and they were delivered to a man named Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. He said to him, take these vessels and go and put them in the temple of Jerusalem. Let the house of God be rebuilt on its site. Then Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundation of the house of God in Jerusalem. And from that time until now, it's been under construction, and it is not yet finished. And now, if it seems good to the king, have a search made in the royal archives here in Babylon to see whether the decree was issued by King Cyrus for the rebuilding of this house of God in Jerusalem. Let the king send us his pleasure in this manner. This is kind of a fascinating recollection of what, the form of this letter is very much how letters were written in this time. So while there's likely some editorializing going on, this is probably the author drawing upon actual copies of letters found in archives of this kind of debate. What's interesting is that Tattenai doesn't stop the builders while he waits for further instruction. So he lets the work continue, but does reach out for further instruction from Darius. The report of verses 11 to 16 generally parallels what we already read in Ezra 1, but, it emphasizes Sheshbazzar's role as governor and does not even mention Zerubbabel. They're clearly trying to tell a simpler story for the sake of a new king, not explain there's this guy, then this guy, then this guy. What it's trying to do is show continuity with the earliest authorization. Tattenai seeks to ascertain both A, whether Cyrus authorized this building, and then B, whether Darius wishes the rebuilding to continue. And we'll find out in chapter 6 what Darius says. So King Darius made a decree, and they searched the archives of the documents stored in Babylon. But it was in Ecbatana, the capital in the province of Media, that a scroll was found on which was written, a record. In the first year of his reign, King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem, that let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices are offered and burnt offerings are brought. Its height shall be 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits, with 3 courses of hewn stone and 1 course of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. Moreover, let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple in Jerusalem, each to its place. You shall put them in the house of God. Now you, Tattenai, governor of the province beyond the river, Shithar, Bozani, and you, their associates, the envoys in the province beyond the river, keep away. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. The cost is to be paid to these people in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, or sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, is the priests in Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his children. Furthermore, I decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of the house of the perpetrator, who shall then be impaled upon it. Woo! That's how you make people follow the law. The house shall be made a dunghill. May the God who has established his name there overthrow any king or people that shall put forth a hand to alter this or to destroy this house of God. In Jerusalem, I, Darius, make a decree. Let it be done with all diligence. And like the part of me that remembers, the great 10 Commandments story, I want to So let it be written, so let it be done, right? You all get that reference, right? I can't do that with other generations. So Ecbatana, this is actually the summer residence of the Persian kings. That's Hamadan in modern Iran. So this is an actual place where the Persian kings did indeed have their summer residence. Notice the archival version of Cyrus's decree is different than what we read in Ezra 1. It emphasizes the building size and funding. And it's also a little more generous. Ezra 1 didn't say anything about King Cyrus offering to pay for the whole thing out of the royal treasury, but shocker, all of a sudden they pulled this letter. Oh no, Cyrus said they wanted to pay for the whole thing. How convenient is that? Geez, this is why it always pays to dig into the records. You never know what you're gonna find there. The support of Darius here, it's generous, it's likely exaggerated. This is once more kind of a glorious reimagining of reality. But if it's reliable, which the support is clear, even though it's being generously described, the support was there. What this probably indicates is Persia's attempt to stabilize its hold on the Mediterranean by securing the goodwill of the people of Yehud. Remember, this is how do we keep the empire strong? We keep the rabble happy, we give them their God, we give them their temple. And then remember where Israel is on the Mediterranean, then we control this area because they are obedient subjects of Darius, because Darius has allowed us to rebuild the temple. He even paid for it out of his own treasury. So there's a political maneuvering going on here, which is actually true. Non-biblical sources show similar support of Egypt's religious institutions, where Darius helped rebuild institutions of Egypt. So this is absolutely, we know, this is a practice of the Mede-Persian Empire, where it's seen as kind of all for Israel here, but we know from other extra biblical sources that this was something that the Mede-Persians did to try to secure control and power for their imperial hegemony. Temple is completed, all that work, and you only get 3 verses for the temple being completed. Then, according to the word sent by King Darius, Tatanai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar, Bozani, and their associates did with all diligence what King Darius had ordered. So the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. They finished their building by the command of the God of Israel, by the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. The completion of the temple is an accomplishment credited to the Judeans, guided by God and authorized by not 1, not 2, but count them 3 Persian kings. This conclusion highlights as well the role of the elders of prophetic inspiration, trying to undergird what will be the authority and the power in this new system that's being established by the rebuilding of the temple. The celebration concludes stage 1 of the return and reconstruction. Stage 2, as we'll get to in the next session, will focus on the rebuilding of the community of Jerusalem, of itself, 7 through 10. And then stage 3, at the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, Nehemiah 1 through 7. But stage 1 is the rebuilding of the temple, and that has now happened, and we are successful, so we are happy. And we conclude with this dedication in verse 16. The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats according to the number of the tribes of Israel. Then they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their courses for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. And on the 14th day of the 1st month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. For both the priests and the Levites had purified themselves, and all of them were clean. So they killed the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests, and for themselves. It was eaten by the people of Israel who returned from exile, and also by all who joined them, separated themselves from the pollution of the nations of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. With joy they celebrated the festival of unleavened bread 7 days, for the Lord had made them joyful, and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them, so that he aided them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. So a few kind of historical inaccuracies here, but it's because they're trying to make a point. The dedication of the second temple is described briefly. There'll be a more extensive celebration in Nehemiah once the city's walls are rebuilt, Because remember, in Ezra and Nehemiah, it's not just about the temple. It's about the temple and the city of Jerusalem, which together comprise the house of God. So we're only partway there in Ezra and Nehemiah's understanding of this story. However, the returned exiles now represent the fullness of Israel. So even though it's just 3 tribes, remember Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites, they offer 12, I should say male goats with an E, not an I, sorry for that. They offer 12 because they now worship on behalf of the full house of Israel. So catch that claiming there that we are now the full house of Israel, so they offer all of it. The celebration of the Passover, of course, would have had special significance for the reconstruction because remember, the return from exile is viewed by some of the second Exodus. In the same way that the Passover marked the Exodus event, the resumption of the Passover ritual in Jerusalem with the sacrificial temple is that we have come back finally to have what had been taken from us. Notice though, whereas others had been excluded from the act of rebuilding, they were allowed to join in the celebration, even circumcised non-Israelites. How fascinating, right? If they would separate themselves from the pollutions of the nations of the land, they were allowed to be a part of the worship. They couldn't help build it, but they could separate themselves and be a part of it. So you're seeing that tension described. And even now we're seeing, well, some of the people of the land aren't half bad. They will, turn from the apostasy that they've got here and they will come and join us in proper rite and ritual worship. The king of Assyria is mentioned here. This is anachronistic. Remember, the king of Assyria is Long-Gad. This is the Persian king. The reason he's called the king of Assyria is because he rules the same territory that the Assyrian Empire had. So this is a reversal of the 8th century exile by Assyria, the Persian emperor now reversing that exile. That's why that's the language that's used at the end of chapter 6. All right, let me turn my share off here. Questions, conversation, thoughts?
I think it went very fast.
Right,
Too fast.
You're right, Barbara. I mean, and it's really kind of fascinating. If you think, the amount of time we took in 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd, the construction of the first temple, huge amounts of literature poured over it. And here, the primary text is arguing over whether or not to rebuild it. But the rebuilding itself occupies a relatively short number of verses, and there's nothing. Think of the celebration of Solomon's temple in 2nd Chronicles with the copious amounts of sacrifice and celebration. It's a much more muted celebration here. It's not nearly what it had been back in the good old days when they knew how to celebrate these things. Other thoughts, comments?
So at this point, and maybe I'm going to embarrass myself because I've been listening closely. Israel isn't self-governed yet. They're still being governed by a foreign entity.
They think of themselves as self-governed.
Okay.
But you're right. Really after the the only time the people of Israel were self-governed was really the time of David and Solomon.
Yeah. Okay.
Right at that first king Rehoboam, already when Rehoboam falls, as we heard, Egypt winds up taking some control.
Yeah.
And so the independence of the people of Israel is a long described dream, rarely believed. They're consistently under the boot. Either they're being pressed by other empires, whether it's Egypt and Assyria or something like that, like you get. They're being conquered by Assyria and becoming vassal states, because the southern kingdom of Judah was a vassal state of Assyria until Zedekiah rebelled against all of this stuff. And then the Babylonians, then they're a vassal of that, then they're a vassal of the Persian Empire. After this, after I finish the Hebrew Bible, I might actually do some work in the Inner Testament books. It'd be interesting to cover the stories of 1st and 2nd Maccabees when they rebel against the empire of Alexander the Great with the Maccabees, and this is the story of Hanukkah and all of that. But then that fails. They're still under that. They're under the Roman Empire. They're constantly under the thumb of someone else. And I think once you get that historical point, you get why the 6-Day War in the beginning of the 20th century, the independence of the nation of Israel was seen as such a profound that it had to be divine intervention for the people of Israel to finally be given autonomy as a nation once more. And that's why Zionism is such a potent force, both in Israel, but also in American evangelical Christianity, who really believe this is God's work restoring what had been lost since the time of Solomon. So, I mean, it's a fascinating historical reality. We think of Israel as kind of this independent nation, but that was something that existed for two monarchs. And even then, David spent most of his reign trying to solidify control. Solomon had control briefly, but how much of that is just nostalgic memory? You know, if the second Solomon's dead, already his son's having to go up north to convince the North not to secede. Was it really a United Kingdom ever? And so there's a real argument to be made that, you know, if originally the Hebrew people were this kind of loose federation of tribes in the Levant, in Canaan, they kind of sort of became a nation, but they didn't ever seem to really pull it off very successfully. Yeah.
Hey, I think for my generation, the comparison is with Russia's satellites after World War II.
Yes.
Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they were on Russian control. They were independent nations, yes, democratic republics. They chose the socialist form because they loved it, but they better not step out of line.
Yeah.
And then when they're independent, that's still a worry. You know, Zedekiah, okay, we put him in there and he's supposed to be loyal to us, but now he wants to join NATO. We better move in.
Uh-huh. Yep, exactly. No, I think you're very much right, Carolyn. Absolutely. Yeah. Good. Well, so next week we won't have class because it's Halloween. I'm going to be trick-or-treating with Lucy, who hopefully will not be feeling sick still at that point. But we should be back. I believe we'll be back the week after that on in November 7th, I think is what that is. So I'll send an email out later this week with some notes and some plans for what we'll focus on for our reading for that class. I will say, kind of as Barbara acknowledged, that, you know, we covered a lot of history in short swoop today. If you didn't get a chance to read through Ezra, it's worth it to sit down and read through Ezra 1 through 6 again. And if you've got a little bit of time, go ahead and go back and read some of Haggai. Because Haggai, of course, is a contemporary of all of this. And notice how Haggai tells the story differently than Ezra does. It's a really fascinating reality that this is, you know, it's all right there in the text if people took the time to read it instead of pretending that the Bible is one single monolithic unit. All right, have a lovely night, everyone. We'll see you all later.